Well, hey everyone, it's Nate here. Happy holidays, and thank you so much for listening to the Vinyl Guide podcast this year. 2020 hasn't been great for a lot of people, but I tell you, we all made it through, and you guys helped me make it through, and I hope in a little way I helped you as well. I always love talking records, and the fact that we have a global audience around the world of great folks like yourself listening in all the time and keeping those spirits high and sending those notes in, well, it really serves such a great purpose here this year. So I want to send my sincere thanks to everyone listening to my voice right now. Again, 2020, I think most of us are glad to see it over. It'll be in the rearview mirror very soon. We've had some amazing guests in 2020, and I'm already lining up some heavy hitters for 2021. So again, thank you so much for listening, for sharing, for giving us those reviews. For those of you who are part of our Patreon page, for those of you who are supporting our sponsors, Groove Washer, AudiofileUSA.com, Seems Easy, and all the others, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure serving with you all, and I look forward to all of us moving into 2021 together. Now this week, on the final show of 2020 of the Vinyl Guide, we are talking all about Fortune Records, the historic and influential record label out of Detroit. We talk about the rise, the records, the decline, the legacy of Fortune Records with Michael Hurtt, one of the authors of the authoritative book of the label, Mind Over Matter, The Myths and Mysteries of Detroit's Fortune Records. Now, I've seen some pretty amazing books on music history and record labels, and this one is right up there at the top. Mind Over Matter is a beautiful book and a deeply comprehensive story of the label and the history of Detroit and the people, all told through the eyes of this incredibly influential and legendary label, Fortune Records. Now, you could pick up a copy of Mind Over Matter online at nortonrecords.com or kickbooks.com. Just Google up Mind Over Matter, Fortune Records, and I'm sure you'll get to the right links. Now, I had the absolute pleasure to talk to Michael for quite a while on Fortune Records, and what you're about to hear now is only part of the conversation. We have an extended interview, an extra 30 minutes or so, only available to our patrons at patreon.com/vinylguide. If you're a patreon.com/vinylguide supporter, well, jump up there now. You could hear the full story. There's extra info there, how Fortune Records dealt with Motown, Fortune Records history with the recordings of John Lee Hooker, more detail of the stories, more record nerdery, etc. So if you enjoy the Vinyl Guide podcast, please consider joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/vinylguide. It's a few bucks a month. You'll get access to extended interviews like this one. You'll get secret episodes and more. Plus, you help keep this show going. So go up there now, patreon.com/vinylguide, join our community, and hear the rest of the show. And just a quick reminder, the Groove Washer is a fantastic holiday gift, either for yourself or for any record collector nerd buddy you have. Everyone needs a record cleaner, so give the gift of the best record cleaner on earth from GrooveWasher.com. Use promo code VinylGuide10 at checkout and save yourself some dough. Give the gift of clean records or get one for yourself and consider it a present for your ears. That's GrooveWasher.com. Discount code VinylGuide10. And if you're giving gifts, don't forget about AudiofileUSA.com. AudiofileUSA.com ships worldwide, and there is still time to get yourself or one of your friends one of the most gorgeous vinyl pressings you'll ever find. With over 42,000 titles in stock, I recommend going to AudiofileUSA.com, dig around for a while, search for your favorite artists, or browse by record label or genre. I always find some really amazing stuff that way. In fact, right now, there is a 1959 mono I'm John Lee Hooker album, original press, factory sealed for over 60 years. This copy was found in an Oakland warehouse where it was untouched for decades. That's the kind of one-of-a-kind stuff you'll find at AudiofileUSA.com. So go to AudiofileUSA.com now and find your holy grail. And finally, if you enjoy this conversation, well, make sure to check out the other episodes of the Vinyl Guide podcast. We have over 250 additional interviews, like episode 251 with world-renowned record collector John Tefteller, episode 231 with jazz legend Lou Donaldson, episode 215, the incredible tale of the mystery record that influenced Elvis, episode 154, a brief history of quadraphonic records, episode 105 with Don Was, president of Blue Note Records, and a heap more. All available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Sonnet, or wherever you get your podcasts. And with the upfronts done, let's start today's conversation with Michael Hurtt, author of Mind Over Matter, The Myths and Mysteries of Detroit's Fortune Records. Hello, Michael.
Hey, Nate. Are we on video or just audio?
Just audio, but I'll tell you what, I'll turn on my camera. We'll just say a quick hello.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
How are you, buddy?
Good, man. Oh, look at all the records behind you. My goodness.
The madness.
Is that part of your research process?
Yeah, I guess you could say that, yeah. That's a very good way to put it, man. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is, actually. That's sort of where it begins, you know?
So this book, Mind Over Matter, The Myths and Mysteries of Detroit's Fortune Records, it is an incredibly beautiful, detailed, in-depth book, and especially for record collectors. Man, it has so much information in there, and I could tell someone who really enjoyed the music and played the records and a true record collector wrote this book. That's what it feels like to me. Is that a fair assessment of kind of where you're coming from?
Oh, for sure. Both Billy Miller, my co-author, and myself, him more than me because he was older than I was, so he'd been in it longer. Mm-hmm. Was just record maniac, you know, just the term I almost don't even like the term collector in a sense because, you know, so many people that collect these things, they put them on a shelf and they're dormant, you know, or whatever, or maybe they put them behind glass. But for Billy and I, as well as our whole milieu,
it's clear you've got them on the floor. So
yeah,
they're
right. I mean, it's like these things get played, and that's the whole point of having them.
Yeah.
And the whole point of searching them out. And when you play them, this, you know, it's like this moment in time that was captured. It's almost like a friend of mine recently was riffing about it and just going on about this stuff. And he said, man, when you put that needle into the vinyl, you're connecting with someone's soul. It's almost like you're resurrecting their spirit, and you're there with them. And in the moment that they recorded that song. And I think that I know that was probably a big inspiration behind not only us writing this book, but the way the approach we took to writing in general, and why we wanted to write about a myriad of musical things and musical stories, because you hear these records and you just immediately, there's this intrigue and mythology, and you just want to know what the story is.
So let's talk about that, because I'm not as familiar with Fortune as many others. Let's start with the story of Fortune. Where did they begin?
Well, they started in Detroit, which is where they remained for their entire existence, in 1946, right after World War II, and the post-war economy, when everything was, especially here in Detroit was called the Arsenal of Democracy, and they outfitted their auto plants or refitted them rather to build planes and, every kind of, tanks and every kind of war material that was needed. And so when the war ended, the spirits were really high just all over the country, I think. And there had been a shellac ban. You couldn't make records really during the war because the material they used to press the 78s was needed for the war effort.
I did not realize that.
Yeah. So they called it the Petrillo ban because the guy that instituted it was a guy named James Petrillo. And, so coming into that was, out of the war was the fact that you could, press records again. And because there was a little bit of money out there, I think, there were all these independent record companies that popped up all over the place. And Fortune was one of them. And a lot of these companies would spring up in the wake of, someone having a distributorship or a record store that carried these underground labels. And they were all kind of linked together, all these independent labels like King and Four Star, and, the list goes on and on.
Mm-hmm.
But there were just hundreds, if not thousands of them. And, oftentimes they would record that. They were the ones recording what later became rock and roll, blues, hillbilly, ethnic forms of music,
mm-hmm.
just all this sort of cultural street level folk music, if you will, of the people. Whereas the major labels, which had, existed prior to the war and afterwards as well, were just clueless. I mean, once in a while they'd hit on something, but
mm-hmm.
most of the time they were trying to control the market just like they do today. But these independent labels were coming up, were basically, bubbling up from the underground, and Fortune was one of them.
What was the life of a typical indie label in the late 40s?
I think, from what I understand, it was a lot of hustling. And, a lot of these records were marketed to jukebox operators as opposed to, the radio. So a lot of times they'll say, not licensed for broadcast and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And Fortune is one of the many things they're known for is their penchant for making what they call party records, which are basically like records that you'd sell under the table, mm-hmm. X-rated, kind of risque, double entendre blues and hillbilly records. And a lot of these things, again, were played on the jukeboxes. So you could really make a lot of money if you had a successful record like that. Mm. And they actually got in trouble, and Jack Brown got arrested and everything for selling. There's an article, we dug up an article. I mean, we didn't realize it's when you look back on it now, you hear these songs and they seem kind of charming, like the Dirty Boogie and the Tattooed Lady, Girdle Grease and Daddy, songs like that Fortune became later, notorious for. But, I had heard from some of the folks that were there, you could really get in trouble for those records. And when you don't really realize, you kind of seem, you could easily dismiss that until you see a newspaper, until you actually find a newspaper article where you realize. And we went into we researched the detail of it. It was amazing how these vice cops and different people tried to crack down on these kinds of records. Mm. So that was, one thing they were doing, one struggle that they were kind of up against, the idea that, okay, we could, here we have a surefire jukebox hit, but, gosh, we kind of don't want people to know we're selling this thing, or we could get in trouble for it, and did get in trouble for it. And then the other thing, I guess the big thing that they were up against was just the same thing that any mom and pop organization, you just really had to be a hustler, and they were. Jack Brown was known for, he'd pull up to a gig, with his station wagon loaded with records, and he knew where every record was. And, he knew just what record would appeal to that crowd in that bar that he was at that night.
Wow.
It's really amazing,
Okay. And in terms of the retail distribution, like right now, most of us will find records at record stores or maybe even buy them online. But back then, there were a lot more options, a lot more smaller, more ways to be able to get a record out there. There were drugstores. There were all sorts of other options for the record purchaser. But out of the back of the car, that sounds particularly onerous and unique.
Yeah, it was guerrilla marketing tactics for sure. He just went into to where he thought people would want the records, and mm-hmm. But you're right. I mean, I remember there was a fascinating facet about King Records. I remember hearing from King Records from Cincinnati was that Sid Nathan, the guy that owned it, would, he had this idea to put his records in places that other people didn't have records. So like the furthest corner of Appalachia or whatever. Mm. And, that was the kind of music he was recording. Again, just like Fortune, hillbilly and blues and these kinds of music that appealed to, basically like blue collar mm-hmm. and, Southern folks in the mountains and in the Mississippi Delta and different places like that. So these guys would just, a guy like him would try to make sure his records were in remote places. And that was sort of how he built part of the way he built his reputation. Fortune had didn't have quite as much, money, basically, mm-hmm. to be honest, as Sid Nathan did. I mean, they were struggling along, but they had a record shop first. they opened the record store, and then they really started the label, I guess, before they had the store, from what I understand. But it was pretty much along the lines of they had started the label, they had a distributorship, Fortune Distributors, and they were distributing these indie labels. And the label just started to take off because they started to run into more musicians in Detroit.
Now, from what I understand, there's also the business. There's the record store, there's the label, but there's also the studio. So if you were back in Detroit in the day and you had $10 in your pocket, you can go to Fortune Records and put your song or your voice on a record. Which was kind of their entry level? Did they start as a studio or the record label, or how did that weave together?
They started as, they started as a sheet music. They started to do sheet music during World War II. Devorah Brown was a aspiring songwriter and almost more of a poet in a way, but she did play piano. And she had very pop, classical, and sort of Tin Pan Alley backgrounds, like a lot of, sort of working or middle class Jewish people at that time. Eddie Cantor, for instance, would be like the kind of thing that they would probably listen to at home. So she was trying to write these pop songs and did successfully get some sheet music out, because Detroit in the early 1900s was a sheet music capital. Back when, prior to records, basically, late 1800s, early 1900s, when you would, instead of buying a record, you would buy sheet music, take it home, and play it on the guitar or the piano for your musical entertainment. So there was still this facilitation to print sheet music here, and they put out probably like a handful, maybe 5, 6, sheet music things. We reproduced some of them in the book. Of her songs. And then as soon as they could make a record, which was 1946, they decided, let's go all out. They hired Artie Field's orchestra and 2 different vocalists, Dorothy Dean and Russ Titus, and did her song Jane, Sweet as Summer Rain. And that was the first Fortune record. And they lost their shirts on it, of course, but they were hooked at that point. They were basically trying to make a pop record in a world of blues and jazz and hillbilly. In other words, they were like trying to do what Capitol Records, would put out there, but they didn't have the distribution to put a record like that out to appeal on a wide scale that, a Capitol or Decca or somebody would, or RCA would. So this heavily orchestrated stuff, it didn't really work for independent labels. Independent labels, they would stumble upon, and this is what happened with the Browns, they would stumble upon the music that was happening in their community, and they start recording that stuff, and it would really that was the stuff they could deal with, because they had a street level kind of distribution. And that's what people were coming in. There were so many people coming up to Detroit for work from the South, from Appalachia, from Mississippi, from Arkansas, and from everywhere, black, white. There were ethno, a lot of different cultures from other countries coming here, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all kinds of, Albania, and all these people brought their culture with them, but also longed to hear, they wanted to hear some music from
their youth. They want to hear the gypsy music. They want to hear mandolins and things.
Exactly. So yeah, if that answers, it's a sort of a long-winded, but as far as what came first, they put out that record, and then right around the time that they put that out, they opened their distributor, which was also a record shop, and then they put up the studio in the back, because they realized if we're going to do anything, we're going to have to do it ourselves.
And from what I understand, they would occasionally find some of their artists who walked in off the street to use their studio, and then realize, wow, this is more than a one-off. We can actually go big with this guy.
Yeah, that's just exactly what you said earlier about, paying $10 or whatever it was. May have been a little bit more, I'm not sure, but that's exactly how they found Nolan Strong and the Diablos, who became one of their most legendary and, their biggest and definitely most legendary in so many ways, both Nolan and the Diablos, both together and separately.
In those days, if an indie like Fortune would have a hit, they must have known their distribution was limited. So I guess it was a bit of a moonshot. And the dream was to put something out and then get the attention of a major label that has a distributorship to then take it to the next level. Was that kind of how the business worked then?
that was how the business worked, but Fortune did not want to work with the business in that way. And that became, to many people, to many outsiders who looked into the story, that became their biggest mistake over the years. But to Billy and I, when we looked at the story, we kind of came to a different analysis, and that it was actually probably what kept them in business. Because a lot of times you get a hit and you license it to, because you couldn't handle it yourself, you license it, and, basically if you didn't have anything to come follow that up with, it was just as big, the distributors wouldn't pay you. And you could have a massive record that you never got paid for and just be forced out of business. And that happened with so many little labels. Mm-hmm. But Fortune, through, I guess, what you might call paranoia or, on an extreme level, or just caution on a less extreme level on the other end of it, they did a little bit of that. They sold the master Force of Jealous Love by the Davis Sisters, which was an early country hit they had, to 4-Star. They sold the Master of Bacon Fat by Andre Williams and the new group to Epic. And then they never sold anything after that. That was the record that they felt in 1956 that they really felt that they didn't get all their money for. And, they really didn't talk about it. They said they licensed it, but we really found out later that they did sell that master. Mm-hmm. And I think they felt like they got burned. And so they licensed Village of Love by Nathaniel Mayer in 1961. Mind Over Matter, the title track, or the title, which became the title of the book, by Nolan Strong, they didn't even license that to anyone. That thing probably could have been way bigger, mm-hmm. So as the years wore on, they became more and more insular in a sense. But that's also what kept them, in business and to a certain extent.
In writing this book, what sort of access did you have to the archives of Fortune?
Almost none. But we were, Sheldon, Jack and Deborah's son, was very giving. He always was willing to talk until, just answer every question I or Billy could come mm-hmm. up with. But sometimes he'd just act irritated and say, I don't know why we did that. There was a lot of that shaking of the head. We should have licensed that. We should have sold that to someone bigger. We really could have done better here, there, and everywhere. There was a sort of exasperated regret that was a part of his delivery that was quite funny, and we actually put some of that. We tried to get that across in the book because he had a really unique way of putting things and his very mm-hmm. funny personality. But we barely could get any photographs. It was just so hard to get that. The whole family is just very, very protective, cautious, and doesn't like to move on things. But we thought, well, we're not going anywhere. They approved of the book being done and he was certainly happy to help us. It was primarily Sheldon. But when it came time to can you send us some photographs of your parents? It's we got a few things, but not much. And we kept dreaming. We almost fantasized this file cabinet into existence. We don't even know if it existed, but we kept on saying, we got to get into that file cabinet. What's in that file? You just imagine there's got to be. But then again, with Fortune, maybe they didn't even keep those kind of paper records.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Is there even a Fortune archive? Is there a collection of tapes and things that are stored somewhere?
They have. Yeah, there is an archive, and we credited the archive to some of the stuff that they let us use in the book. Mm-hmm. But it's not anything that's available to anyone like us, or unfortunately, as close as we are, and we were as close mm-hmm. as anybody, and still are. But hopefully when the time comes, if the time comes, they'll think of us and maybe we'll be able to do something with the stuff. That's, of course, our long-term hope.
At what point did you go from, oh, I really like these Fortune records, to I'm going to write the authoritative tome on this label?
Well, it was in 2009, basically, that we decided to actually do it. Mm-hmm. And we had talked about it we had kind of joked back and forth about it for a number of years, because Billy and I were both love this label so much, and it was one of the many things that we would always return to. Mm-hmm. Talking, or I was visiting them, Billy and Miriam, his wife, who was also just as into this stuff as he was. In New York City, I would visit him maybe once a year if I could, or around Christmas, whatever. And And we would talk on the phone and email and stuff like that. And we'd always return to, oh man, this is the best label ever. And somebody should do a book on it, Well, but they'd have to be as crazy as us, And then finally we just decided to do it. And Billy once we decided, he was like, he just said, we should really do this. And he just started emailing me. And it was just like the road, the rubber met the road, because we didn't even really know at that time quite what it was going to become at all. Initially, we had thought about getting some, sort of writing chapters ourselves, but also asking some other folks to write chapters, like people like Lenny, and other people that we knew were into Fortune. But it ended up that it just didn't seem like that was quite going to work, and that we just better do the whole thing ourselves. And so within a year, we pretty much had the plan.
With the distribution of Fortune, it would seem to be concentrated in Detroit. How much further afield did Fortune Records get?
Some people would say that barely got past Ohio, Pittsburgh, Cleveland. Mm-hmm. Obviously a lot of the records went back down south, but a lot of times the artists carried them down there, and they were going back down there to play. But yeah, the distribution did not go too far. Mm-hmm. I mean, too far out of like a 5 or 6 state area, probably.
Right.
And really, maybe even almost like a tri-state area in a sense.
Because I would imagine in Detroit, you could still find them pretty readily at yard sales or things like that. But the further afield you go, it would be more collectors and shops, yeah?
You mean then or now?
Well, I'll say the last 20 years, probably when you started thinking about the book and creating it.
You know what? Ever since I've lived here, I've never been able to find. They've always been hard to find. And that's 50 years. I wish it was that way. There's so many that I still don't have. I have a lot, but it's incredible. It's almost like this label is collectible from the minute the records hit the street, and a lot of these doo-wop guys that are a part of the Fortune of Hits collectors' stories in the back, and they tell their stories and their relationship to it. And a lot of it revolves around Times Square Record Shop, which was a legendary record shop in New York City that had its heyday in the 60s. And, had a lot to do with Fortune Records coming, being sold in New York City and stuff. These guys talk about this stuff, and it's like, wow, they were thinking these records were legendary when they were new. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because you find a lot of record labels where they'll put something out, there will be a certain popularity or a buzz around it, and then it becomes, okay, well, that's 3 or 4 years ago, man, we got to put it in the cutout bin. And Fortune never really thought of themselves that way. They always valued what they'd done, and in turn, a lot of the people that collected the music or were fans, became fans of the label. It's interesting. I can't think of another label, and I'm sure there are some, but another label that's quite like this in that sense, that to where the music was just absolutely collectible almost right away.
What are some of the more collectible Fortune records? So maybe some of the rarest or some of the ones that the collectors desire the most?
Well, there's one called the Blues Holy Grail is called Drunk Drivers Comin', back with Stolen Property by the Richard Brothers. Mm-hmm. And the Richard Brothers were two real down home sounding, almost street type musicians, the kind of guys you'd hear on the corner,
Yeah, that's on. I found it on Discogs. It's also on YouTube in case anyone wants to hear it. Yeah. That looks like it's on a label called Straight 8.
Yeah.
So Fortune had a few side labels as well.
Yes, it did. They had Haiku, they had Straight 8, they had Renown, which was a very short-lived hillbilly subsidiary in the early 50s, and they also had a few other ones, including Rendezvous, which only put out one record. 5 years ago, and another one called Rialto, which also put out just one record.
Right.
So I don't know what most of the time when people have subsidiaries, they either do it for a certain type of music, or the biggest reason they do it is so that when they send records to DJs, it doesn't just look like, oh my God, there's another Fortune record. Mm-hmm. They could send them records on 3 different labels instead. Maybe they'll get more airplay. But in Fortune's case, it didn't seem like sometimes they would keep I mean, the genres were just all over the place in all the different numbering systems and labels and everything else. You know, it's interesting.
I hear there were times where they also used the same matrix numbers, the same product numbers across the board, just adding to the confusion of future record collectors.
Yes, confounding, record collectors just tearing their hair out. This doesn't make any sense. And along with it came these mythological stories that have never been proven. Like one of them is that, Spider Turner's Ride in My 225 came out on, as Fortune 225. Well, it never did come out. No one's ever seen one that we could ever find,
right.
But it was in discographies, and there was other records in the discographies that we could never find to exist either. And then there were a lot of them that were missing, and this information just gets handed down, and who knows whether that information could have come from the Browns themselves. They might have said, well, we wanted to put out the Spider Turner record under this number, but we did it under this number instead, maybe it was misunderstood. Maybe they'd written it down. They planned to release it. It never came out. There was several things like that. There was an Orlando King record that the titles, the number, everything, it was never issued in the discographies. And then there was also a Davis Sisters album that was planned and advertised, but never materialized.
How many of these would they typically press up?
I think that it's a little bit more than some people think. Some people will say, they only press 100 or 200. I think it was closer to 5 typically. I mean, there might be some cases where they only press a very, very small quantity, but I think most of the time it was at least 500 records or 4,000, and then up from there.
If they were feeling particularly confident, they would go north of that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. If they were feeling confident about a record, I mean, they would, then again, sometimes it was very hard to figure out what they were trying to do a lot of times. And that was one of the fun things about writing this book.
So,
tell the story.
And where did they get the records pressed?
They got different pressing plants.
Okay.
Sheldon in Chicago was one of the ones they used a lot. I'm pretty sure they got some done in Owasso, where a lot of people in Detroit got records pressed. But yeah, they did different. They went around to different pressing plants. Okay. Some of the gospel records, which are probably were pressed in lower quantity, trying to date those things was incredibly hard because, I mean, basically the only thing we really had to go on was the interviews that we had done with people and people that I had talked to here in the gospel scene, and just go into these church programs and trying to ask them, oh, you remember this group? Okay, they did this record. When were they around? And just trying to get an idea when they could have made these things and listen what they sounded like, which is with Fortune, you sometimes, it could be a record that was made 10 years earlier and it's going to, you're going to find out it was made in 1964. It might sound like it was made in 1954. So, but I remember trying to look into dead wax, studying dead wax of all those gospel records I could not figure out where they were pressed.
You just mentioned there's a lot of, I'll call it conjecture about, which records came out, which ones didn't. Are there any Fortune records which exist but are totally missing? No one's yet to find a copy of it.
No, not that I know exist. Not that I'm sure, because if no one's found a copy to me, I'm not sure it exists.
Okay.
I think it might be more of a rumor, and that's sort of what we go on with the discography in the back. Because we really wanted that discography to be, it's not the final word. It never is. Discography almost never is, but almost the final word. And we really wanted to just dispel those discographies online that have been repeated with the wrong information over and over and over again to the point of almost becoming fact, where people just insist that, but yet nobody's seen the record, or they get the year wrong, because they just never bothered to ask, and somebody told them it was issued whenever they said, and it got written down that way.
Now, in the book, you show many sample pressings, acetates, those sort of things. I think there are $5 records. The Diablos are the ones that jump immediately to mind. I'm guessing those are exceedingly hard to find. Where did you source those for the book? Most of those scans are either from Billy's collection, Billy and Miriam's collection. They have almost a complete Fortune collection, almost every record.
that we know to exist. I have a pretty good one myself. So a lot of them came from here as well, from me. And then if we had other friends of ours that, we basically put the call out, and I just, hey, we need this scan, can you, do you have a label scan of this? Can you send it to us? We had a lot of people contributing that type of stuff, which was really amazing. But sometimes some of the records that are a bit more on the beat up side, or the labels are a bit stuffed up with some character. I mean, they've been through something. I mean, it tells you, about the record. And while you want to have a nice, clear and clean label scan so people can see it, it's like sometimes that was all you can get, and it's very representative of how people have thought of these records and treated these records over the years. They partied with these records. They played the things,
Yeah.
So, and they're still here. I mean, a lot of them can really take a beating and still sound amazing.
It gives them character, and I absolutely agree.
Exactly. So I'm kind of glad it turned out that way.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the family has a whole collection, or almost a complete collection of Fortune records. Are the master tapes still in existence?
Yeah, the master tapes are in existence, yeah.
Okay.
And I'd really love to, if we could ever get them to green light any kind of just, us archiving, or, without putting the cart before the horse, like helping to get this stuff back out into the world and reissuing it, then it would just be our dream come true to go through those tapes, because who knows what's on there. There might be unreleased stuff, We don't really know, because we haven't, like I said, I mean, we're closer than anybody else, but still not that close,
Who owns the rights to the Fortune catalog today?
The family still. It's still the family. They've always owned it.
Mm-hmm.
It's never gone out of their hands. Which, again, I mean, some people would look at that as well, I mean, it's too bad that this stuff's not out there in the world. It's getting bootlegged, and that's true. But at the same time, it's also great that some major label didn't buy it, like Universal, and, they didn't know what they had, and everything burns down or whatever. I mean, you hear these horror stories of these big labels that buy this stuff up, and then little people like us, Norton Records, we want to do a reissue project, and we've written this book, and we approach these people, and they won't even come to the table with you unless you can talk, and well, you got to press this many, and they're not into the passion project idea, which can actually be, as quite, and as Fortune demonstrated originally back in the day, they can be quite successful. You're just putting out whatever, you start with 1,000, 2,000 copies, whatever. I mean, you just keep, but the passion is what keeps it going, and that's what keeps it in the world. And so, in a sense, I have to say that the fact that the family never, that the stuff has remained in their hands is generally a really good thing, because who knows what could have happened to it if they didn't feel like they had something important.
For folks who are not as familiar with Fortune, where would you recommend we start that YouTube journey, or even if we're looking for records, what's a good entry point that you would recommend for Fortune?
I think that the way a lot of people enter Fortune is through the doo-wop vocal groups, like the Diablos, No One's Strong in the Diablos, and that's a great place to start, because it's like the wind. It's just like nothing that came before and nothing that came after. It's just an incredible song, a huge influence on Smokey Robinson. Those guys were, and so that they really are Fortune. They represent all the other worldliness of Fortune Records, and the unique eccentricity and the sort of exoticism and mysticism of the label. And then also Andre Williams, who is another guy I'm basically naming Fortune's big three to start with. No One's Strong in the Diablos, Andre Williams, and Nathaniel Mayer. Andre Williams was almost like proto hip hop in a sense. I mean, deadpan, just a total jive talking madman, hilarious. Always basically said that he knew he couldn't really sing, so he had to figure out something else to do to be in a group. And if he could talk shit and make people laugh and dance and execute, basically. And he had a lot of originality, man. His songs were, I'm not so sure that he would have been that anybody else would have really recorded him with the kind of material he was coming up with.
Right.
And that's one thing that was cool about it. One of the coolest things about Fortune is just how open-minded Jack and Devorah Brown were. That they were crazy enough to put out a record like bacon fat or jailbait or put a chain on it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, any of these Andre Williams songs, you know, the greasy chicken, you know, it's just crazy that, I mean, and again, they were just like nothing that had come, you know, nothing else out there. And then Nathaniel Mayer, who was just absolutely cataclysmic soul rocker, if you will, just a guy, you know, one of these Detroit, just caterwauling kind of like soul shattering Detroit screamers that could also just sing real intimately and beautifully as well. Just had this raw edge to him, and he just sounds like he's exploding off the wax. You know, he basically had as much rock and roll in him as he had rhythm and blues. You know, and it's sort of that doo-wop colliding with soul, with a rock and roll band backing him up, type of sound that was really percolating through the streets in the early '60s, and other people recorded it, but you know, Motown had songs like that, like Bye Bye Baby by Mary Wells as an example. But nobody did it really like Fortune and Nathaniel. I mean, he really harnessed it like no other. So I think those are three good places to start, but also something that shouldn't be neglected is the rockabilly and the hillbilly stuff that Fortune did. They did some just fantastic, greasy, you know, white rock and roll, guys like Johnny Powers and Del Vaughan with Rock the Universe, you know, the Tarragon Brothers, Hi Ho Little Girl, which is basically like, sounds like the Everly Brothers with this just manic, you know, insane guitar coming out of nowhere. Really, really cool. It's like two worlds colliding on vinyl, you know. And also and again, I mentioned bluegrass earlier. The bluegrass stuff they recorded was just really intense and amazing. And you know, it's hard to find records, anybody really, that there, besides a few major labels, that they recorded bluegrass in the 50s. You know, it really became more of a 60s phenomenon, even though the music started and really become popular in the late 40s with Bill Monroe. But, you know, Fortune, there were all these bluegrass people up there, and Fortune recorded them. And something about their studio really made that music sound good in there. And they really pioneered a lot of that important bluegrass. You know.
So Fortune really got underway in the late 40s, made records throughout the 50s into the 60s. How did it start to wind down? What did the end of Fortune look like?
You know, obviously the measuring, you always have to talk in Detroit, any story that was ongoing during the rebellion or riot of July 67, that always affects in some way, whether it's inadvertently or whether it's directly. And, you know, a lot of studios suffered and record stores were burned down and destroyed in that melee. But Fortune wasn't. They were a little bit further. You know, the neighborhood they were in was just a few miles from where the flashpoint of 12th and Claremont, which is where that all started. And there were some other smaller disturbances around the city going on during that week. But they didn't directly get hit, or their neighborhood did not directly suffer. But, you know, people had already started to move out of the city, the whole white flight thing and all of that, you know, that urban crisis tale that any city faced during those years was definitely going to affect a, you know, urban record label like this, record store, place of community where cultures came together. It's sad in a sense what happened in a place like Stax. I mean, that's a sort of a well-known story. They basically say once the things started to, you know, take over in the late 60s and all this, that suddenly things were different there between the black and white guys that had been working there, you know, together for years with no problems at all. It was almost like, well, now we need to really think about this. Before, they never even thought about it, you know. Fortune, we didn't find any stories really like that necessarily that were that extreme. I mean, it still remained a place where its artists would return, whether it was like Eddie Kirkland, you know, Killer Blues to Gypsy of the Blues, you know, amazing guitar player, John Lee Hooker, Roy Hall, you know, hillbilly piano pounder who was always, you know, rambling between Detroit and Nashville. So many of these folks would be gone for 5 years and come back through there. It seemed like that kind of social crisis didn't really affect them that much. But, you know, being in Detroit where all that had happened, where in a sense it was like gosh, I mean, that Detroit was the 60s story, the, urban crisis story in a nutshell. I mean, everything that happened here. The more you go into it, the more you find out. But there was also this incredible rise and explosion of soul music that had been buoyed, of course, by Motown. Mm-hmm. And there are all these it started with all these record labels popping up all over the place in the early 60s. And a lot of them were still popping up throughout the late 60s and into the early 70s. And some of them were getting really big, like Invictus Hot Wax was a prime example of that, a label that was owned by Holland, Dozier, and Holland, the three key songwriters from Motown. So I think that, I imagine Jack and Dvorak sitting in the crumbling cinder block empire of Fortune Records on 3rd Avenue, and with the sort of, as the sun is sort of setting on the label and their whole dream and everything, partially just because they've been in business at that point for, 20 years, going really strong and everything else. Mm-hmm. But part of the reason that I would imagine this is I would think, okay, so many of the people that started here are now making records over here and here and here. And, you can hear Melvin Davis's voice is at the number one spot with, on the lead vocals of The 8th Days, You've Got to Crawl Before You Walk. He's playing drums around the corner with, Dennis Coffey and Lionel Woodard packing them in. Meanwhile, you've got, trying to think of some other examples, Spider Turner's on MGM. They never really let Nathaniel go, so he's still around, but he's not recording for him anymore because he's pissed off because he's had offers for other labels and he hasn't been able to get there because of the Fortune contract. So it's, there's all this stuff going on. So many people that had come through that. Obviously, all the Motown people, so many of the Funk Brothers had played on their sessions. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't like they begrudged anybody, I don't think. I think it was, I kind of came to the belief that maybe they just thought, you know what, we're just doing our own thing over here. We can't necessarily compete with these slick studios and this slick soul sound, because it had really gotten some Motown, really clean, really presented things in such a fastidiously together and slick kind of radio-friendly way, which was the polar opposite of what the Fortune sound was, and sound and spirit.
But at the end, did you get the impression at the end that there was, I'll call it a regret or maybe a slight envy that they weren't lifted to the level of other labels?
The short, yeah, I know I'm rambling, but the short answer is no. I think that they were able to look around and see all these folks that had started there and worked with them and gone on to bigger and better things, and be happy about it, but not be regretful, not feel like, boy, it should have been us or anything like that. I think that they actually believed so much in what they did and doing their own thing. And maybe it was just because they were so eccentric that they just didn't care. Maybe they were too crazy just like Billy used to say, they'd have to be as crazy as us to write a book about Fortune Records. Well, maybe the Browns were just crazy enough to not give a damn. But I feel like they really valued what they did and didn't try to fit what they did into a mold of what someone else was doing, what the final analysis was going to be, down the road, as far as like who was going to be remembered, who was going to be given credit, whatever. It's almost like they knew what they had. I think that's sort of that's the final analysis. I think is really that. I mean, they had several issues, and also the time had gone by. They were getting older. Jack and Dvorak both got hit by a car crossing the street in 1973, and they'd already pretty much stopped recording a few years before that. But that probably they always had plans to continue and to do things, and they did to a certain extent. But that really put the brakes on things, I think, a lot, because Jack was crippled and they couldn't be in motion like they'd always been before. But I don't think that they ever regretted anything, really. I think they, did what they did and were proud of it. And I think that's sort of the magic of the label.
All right. Well, you've written a wonderful book, Michael. You and Billy have created this world through this book, and it's also 576 pages, something better edge, and they're beautifully printed, colored pages with pictures and images. It's not just text, and record labels, but it's also postcards and pictures and matchbooks of the era, really telling the whole story. So it's really well done. And I could tell, maybe much like Fortune, there's a care in this product that goes into it that exceeds I'll call it the commercial viability and expectations, but
definitely
it's there because it's important.
Yeah, that was our whole goal. We were like, we might as well go as far. And Miriam Lina, Billy's wife, who co-founded and runs Norton and Kicks Books now, co-founded it with him. Mm-hmm. She was right on board with the whole thing. Like, more is more. That was her quote. And we're going to do this like just how you guys. I mean, we all had the same vision. We didn't even have to. We started to talk about it, and it was like, one of us would finish the other one's sentences. So. And thankfully, and our designer, Elizabeth Van Italy, same thing. She was just amazing. I just barely had to tell her what we had in mind, and she just came up with just a really great template for us to work with and to get everything in there and as much as we could. Mm-hmm. And, that was the point was, and the way we've always approached, the way Billy and Miriam have always approached their projects and the way I've always approached my writing and my projects as well, is that these stories deserve to live and come to life. These people... just like a record, just like I said earlier about putting the needle in the groove and this whole, basically you're time traveling, you're resurrecting a spirit, mm-hmm. That's how it should be when you open a book, as opposed to this, okay, and then the guy went to this radio station, and, these books that just, a lot of music study ends up becoming, and writing becomes too academic, mm-hmm. and it becomes it disconnects the reader from the subject. And what we're trying to do is, we want this stuff to jump off the page. We wanted people, because to us, this stuff lives, and like we were saying before, the music's out there, thankfully, on YouTube. And not just, even if the Fortune catalog was available 100%, you could buy it all. There's so many other things we're dealing with this in this book, and so many other record labels and stuff like that, that's the beauty of being able to stop. A lot of people tell me, including my dad, well, I read a little bit and then I have to go listen to some stuff that you guys are talking about. And that's a really cool way to do it, But yeah, it was really all the things you said. I appreciate the compliments, and it just couldn't have been done any other way. That was the way we felt it had to be presented. And these stories are so incredible, and these people deserve to have these things live. Mm-hmm. So there we go.
You've done well. So people can check out Mind Over Matter, The Myths and Mysteries of Detroit's Fortune Records at Norton Records, Kicks Books. Just Google it up, and a few options will come to pick up a copy of this. And again, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the Vinyl Guide, man.
Thank you, brother.
Oh, man, these are the exact sort of conversations I absolutely love to have here on the show, learning more about these record labels, these old stories, and it's just so fascinating, the rare records and everything. And by the way, there's another huge part of this interview available only to our Patreon community, patreon.com/vinylguide. Please consider supporting us. A few bucks a month goes a long way, helps keep this podcast going, and you get extended interviews and secret episodes and early access to episodes and more. Patreon.com/vinylguide. And don't forget to pick up a copy of Mind Over Matter, The Myths and Mysteries of Detroit's Fortune Records. Google it up. You'll find the links and add one of those to your gift list. And that is it for this episode of the Vinyl Guide. We are closing out 2020 together, people. It's been an amazing year here on the show. It's been a crap year outside of my house, but I tell you, I want each of you to please have a wonderful and safe holiday. We're almost through this pandemic. Let's not get crazy. Let's not get comfortable. Let's just stay the course, stay home, spin some records, and enjoy past episodes of this podcast if you get bored with that. I want to give a huge shout out to the folks who are part of our patreon.com/Vinyl Guide community. Going to call them out by name, starting with Derek King, TJ, Gene Bartram, Matthew Haraney, Robbo444, Aaron Goodrich, David Zimgrobski, Caitlin O'Connor, Sam Cohen, Miguel Alvarez, Chris Glue, EM, Carolina Hidalgo, Patrick Thompson, Eric Lands, Brian King, Christian Death, Michael Scholar Jr., Tejot, Little Tommy Nothing says I love you like a brick through the window, no shoes, Jason, Gregory Plass, Dayton Cantley, Michael McLennan, Bruno Bissonette, Tom Grover Beery, Chuck Boyd, Declan Phoenix, David Well Beloved, Dan T, Trostles, Kevin Mosher, David Phillips, Regis Wack, Michael Howerton, James Dumont, John Lilliquist, David Messer, Michael J. Calusi, Tim Clifford, Jen D. Eugenio, Timo Christofferson, Jonathan Macha, Sean Kenny, Jose Marcel Berto de Souza, and Sean Friggin Kelly. Thank you all so much for your support. Again, it means the world to me, and I hope you guys are enjoying the extended episodes and all the other stuff we throw up on the patreon.com/Vinyl Guide community. I'm going to keep raising the bar on myself. I'm going to keep pushing the boundaries of the show to keep doing these better and better and better. So looking forward to 2021 with you all, and stay home, stay inside, spin your records, and we'll be back next year with a brand new season, a brand new series of the Vinyl Guide. So until we talk next time, keep spinning. Cheers.
That's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Send your thoughts to Nate at thevinylguide.com or follow or tag us on Instagram at Vinyl Guide. Until next time, keep spinning.